Ever get that feeling? Like the problems we're facing, I mean, the huge ones like climate change or, social inequality are just so big that it's impossible for any of us to actually make a dent.
It's easy to feel that way, right? Like you're just one person. What can you really do?
Totally. But what if I told you that some of the most powerful forces for change come from those seemingly small local efforts, the ones that start at the grassroots level?
That's exactly what we're diving into today. How these grassroots movements that often start small and local can gain traction and actually create significant change even in the face of these huge global challenges.
And to really get into this, we've been digging into a ton of different sources.
Yeah, we've been listening to all these insightful conversations with activists who are really in the trenches working on environmental and social justice issues.
We've also learned from NGO leaders working at a global scale.
And to round it out, we've been looking at the analysis of academics who really study the dynamics of how social change happens. A lot of this has been from these fascinating conversations available on YouTube,
Yeah, real people on the front lines of these movements.
sharing their experiences and insights.
So our mission for this deep dive is to try and understand what makes these grassroots movements tick.
What are the key ingredients that make them effective?
What battles are they up against? What kind of opposition are they facing?
Let's be real, sometimes there can be internal complexities within these movements.
But the most important thing for all of us listening is how can we actually get involved and make a difference?
So maybe we can start with the basics. What actually defines a grassroots movement?
Yeah. I think when people hear grassroots, they might picture, I don't know, like a group of villagers in a developing country.
Right. And while those certainly are examples, it's important to remember that grassroots activism is everywhere.
It really is a global phenomenon.
These movements are happening all around us, at all different levels of society,
To your own neighborhood
to your city,
or channel level.
even international stages.
It's not just this far off thing.
Exactly.
So these movements, they often spring up organically, right? From shared concerns.
Right. A collective feeling that something needs to change.
A wrong needs to be righted.
It could be something super local, like a park in your neighborhood that's threatened by development.
A lack of affordable housing in your community.
Or those big issues we talked about earlier, like the environment.
But something we noticed in our sources is how these movements connect those seemingly local, smaller problems to larger systemic issues.
Yeah, that was so fascinating to see.
There's a growing awareness among activists and thinkers about how interconnected all these struggles actually are.
Like we saw tons of examples of how environmental pollution isn't just about industrial practices,
It's tied to racism.
where marginalized communities often bear the brunt of environmental hazards.
And then you have neocolonialism,
Yeah.
where resource extraction in the global south ends up fueling consumption in the global north.
Exactly, exacerbating inequality.
And these connections often extend to economic disparities.
Even gender discrimination.
It's all intertwined.
It really is about seeing that bigger web of injustice.
Okay, so once you start to see those connections and you see how big this web is, how do you actually gain momentum?
And how do you inspire people to get
The
involved?
central theme we kept hearing was this idea of owning the narrative.
That was huge.
Because think about it, large corporations, established governments, they have so much power
And resources.
dedicated to shaping public opinion.
Maintaining the status quo.
Right, they have these sophisticated public relations machines.
Grassroots movements often don't have those same financial resources.
No, they don't.
So their power lies in their ability to articulate a counter-narrative
To challenge those dominant stories.
and offer a different vision.
A different vision of how things could be.
And it's not just about presenting facts and figures.
Right. We saw how creative expression was so central.
Yeah. Things like music, poetry, storytelling.
Visual arts.
It's not just something fun they do on the side. These are core tools for connecting with people on an emotional level.
Tapping into their values and their motivation for wanting to see things change.
And I think if you look at this historically, there's a real connection there to this idea of having a creative vision for the future.
We came across this interesting comparison to figures like Leonardo da Vinci
Oh, yeah. Individuals who are often seen as misfits in their own time.
because they had the ability to think outside the box.
See beyond those limitations of conventional thinking.
And that capacity to envision something different is crucial for imagining a more just and sustainable world.
And then working towards it.
So it's not just about saying what you're against.
Right. You can't just be negative all the
It
time.
has to be inspiring.
You need to bring people in with a positive vision of something better.
paint a picture of a future they actually want to be a part of.
But of course, it's not always easy.
No. These movements face real challenges.
Real resistance.
And we're talking about powerful pushback from those entrenched interests.
Those governments and corporations with a lot of financial and political power.
In our research, we heard about some pretty concerning examples.
Like the proposed budget cuts to the EPA.
Which directly undermines the efforts to protect our environment.
Air and water.
Then you have the lobbying efforts by polluting industries.
Working against meaningful environmental regulations.
And it's not just about policy either. One activist we heard from talked about this insensitivity from some administrations.
Towards the impact of their policies on everyday people.
Exactly. And one source even mentioned climate change programs being dismissed as crazy stuff.
It's like they're not even taking it seriously.
And it's important to stay vigilant because even when you have a victory, it can be followed by setbacks.
One example was the Senate vote to roll back those methane emission protections.
Which happened shortly after the firing of FBI Director Comey.
Right. It shows how environmental concerns can be sidelined so easily.
Or even deliberately undermined.
Especially during other political events.
And sometimes it's not even this outright aggressive opposition. There are these complexities around funding.
And what some call co-option.
This concept of corporate social responsibility, or CSR, on the surface, it sounds like a good thing, right?
Yeah. Companies trying to be environmentally or socially conscious.
But the concern is that CSR can actually be used as a smokescreen.
A way to deflect criticism.
While masking a lack of real accountability.
If corporations can successfully present this image of themselves as being responsible, it can actually reduce the pressure for real change.
It's like saying, look, we're doing our part without actually addressing the root of the problem.
Right.
So how do these grassroots movements actually create change?
Especially when facing these powerful forces.
And how do they keep their supporters engaged?
One of the most important strategies is engaging directly with your elected officials.
At every level.
Local, state, and federal.
Make your voice heard.
Demand action from the people who represent you.
And we learned that it's not enough to just send an email.
Right. While emails are okay, phone calls tend to have a bigger impact.
That direct personal connection is harder to ignore.
Something else that's super valuable is public engagement, especially when Congress is on recess.
Because they go back to their home districts.
And you can attend town hall meetings.
Local events.
Even community festivals.
It's a chance to ask questions face to face.
Share your concerns.
Hold your representatives accountable.
And there are even organizations like Indivisible.
That provide tools and resources to help people organize effectively.
Empowering individuals to take collective action in their communities.
But to be effective, you need to understand the bigger picture.
The political and economic landscape.
Things like OpenSecrets.org, which tracks the flow of money in politics.
And the League of Conservation Voters Scorecard.
You can find it at scorecard.lcv.org.
They rate politicians on their environmental voting records.
So you can actually see who's influencing decisions.
And where your elected officials stand on these key issues.
And speaking of money in politics, we have to mention dark money.
And Citizens United.
The Citizens United ruling basically lets corporations and outside groups spend unlimited amounts of money on campaigns.
Often without even disclosing where the money comes from.
It's really changed the game when it comes to campaign finance.
Giving huge influence to corporations and special interests.
And it can be really hard to even track.
So where do NGOs and networks fit into all of this?
That's a great question. Our sources emphasize the role of NGOs and networks in amplifying grassroots efforts.
They can mobilize broader support.
Provide resources and expertise.
Connect these local struggles to a larger stage.
Think about the role of NGOs at the UNFCCC.
The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Exactly. A perfect example.
There's also this idea of sharing capacities within these networks.
So instead of every local group having to build everything from scratch,
they can share skills and knowledge.
Making everyone more effective.
But, and this is important, not all NGOs are created equal.
Just like with CSR, it's important to remember that.
Some NGOs might have close ties to corporations.
Or be influenced by certain funding agendas.
So you had to look beyond the name.
Understand their values.
Their actions.
Where their funding comes from.
But there is some good news. We're seeing this growing recognition of indigenous knowledge.
And platforms like the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform within the UNFCCC.
It shows an understanding that local and indigenous communities have valuable perspectives.
And traditional ecological knowledge that is essential for tackling environmental challenges.
So let's talk about funding.
The lifeblood. of any movement.
Where does the money for these grassroots movements come from?
And how does that funding impact what they can do?
We learned about some real power dynamics in traditional philanthropy.
Those bureaucratic processes can sometimes make it really hard for grassroots organizations to access the funding they need.
There's a real push to fund proximate leaders.
People with lived experience in their communities.
They understand the challenges and opportunities better than anyone.
We also heard about risk aversion in philanthropy.
Where funders can be hesitant to support newer leaders or more innovative ideas
That can stifle creativity.
and limit the potential for real change,
Many activists and funders advocate for trust-based philanthropy.
which is about providing general support rather than funding for very specific projects.
And making multi-year commitments so these groups have stability.
Trusting that these organizations know how to best use the resources.
Listening to the activists themselves was so insightful.
It really gave us a sense of what kind of support is actually needed.
And it goes beyond just funding specific projects.
There's a huge need for mental health support within these communities.
Because confronting these systemic injustices can be incredibly traumatizing.
There's also a push to provide resources for mutual aid initiatives.
Those community-led efforts to provide direct assistance and build solidarity.
And long-term investment in building sustainable power at the local level is key.
The pandemic really highlighted all of this.
We saw how top-down aid approaches often struggled to actually reach the people who needed it most.
While community-led mutual aid initiatives were so effective.
And thankfully, it seems like some philanthropic organizations are starting to shift towards more collaborative decision-making,
And activist-led grant-making.
putting more power in the hands of the people,
So to put it all together, let's look at some success stories.
and the lessons we can learn from them.
We mentioned the fight against the rollback of methane emissions regulations,
Or real victory.
showing that collective action can work even against powerful interests.
The Chevron case in Ecuador is another really powerful example.
It's been going on for decades.
Local communities fighting against corporate power.
It's a story of resilience and determination.
It also shows how important it is to adapt your narrative and strategies over time.
To resonate with different audiences and stay relevant.
Exactly.
We also learned about distributed actions in these global movements.
Where coordinated but often localized efforts can have a much wider impact.
Like the global climate strikes.
So the big takeaway here is that even facing these huge challenges, creative vision, a compelling narrative, and sustained collective action at the grassroots level can create real change.
So the next time you feel like you're just one person, that your actions don't matter, remember the power of these movements.
Change happens when people connect through shared values, find their voice, and organize.
It starts at the local level.
We encourage you to think about the issues you care about most.
How can you support grassroots efforts in your own community?
Every contribution counts.
And one final thought to leave you with. The indigenous prophecy of the eagle and the condor. It speaks of a time when two ways of knowing and being, the analytical path of the eagle and the more intuitive, earth-connected path of the condor, will come together.
Perhaps these interconnected, visionary grassroots movements represent the unfolding of that prophecy
Offering the potential for a powerful new consciousness.
and the creation of a more just and sustainable world for all.
Look into it. It's fascinating stuff.
Definitely worth exploring.
See you next time.